Welcome everybody to this Pesticide Free Towns event. It's an important thing for me, and that's why I've been asked to chair this session today. That I come from an unusual situation of having several angles at which this is important for me. That I'm a local government representative in a town, a village actually, where I entered on a platform to green our community from both an energy point of view and a biodiversity point of view as well. I'm also a committee member of our local Climate Action Network, where we are implementing projects to arrest negative climate change practices and replace them with environmentally positive practices. So from a local government point of view, I'm involved, but I'm also involved as a board member of Pan Europe and passionately believe that we have a better future without a reliance on pesticides in our agriculture, but we certainly don't need them in our towns and cities as we go forward. It's totally unnecessary and inappropriate. The Sustainable Uses Directive, and indeed the EU and national legislation, should support anyone that wants to go that step further. We should encourage and support towns and communities that want to take that extra step and become pesticide free. We should not be taking legal action against them. We need pioneers to make the change. Let's hear from our really good speakers on this very important day when we have actually released a report that you'll all have access to. So our first speaker is Andrew Owen Griffiths from UNIDEF in Grange in DG Santé. Andrew, please take the stage.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Thank you for the invite to talk here today, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. Can I just check before I start that you can hear me okay and you can see the presentation? Yep, excellent. I see some thumbs up. That's what I like to hear. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Andrew Owen Griffiths. I work for the European Commission's DG Santé, DG Health and Food Safety, and I'm specifically responsible for the sustainable use of pesticides legislation, amongst other things. But at the moment, heavily involved in the rewriting of the sustainable use of pesticides legislation and the related targets under the farm to fork strategy regarding pesticide reduction. So the work and the scope obviously goes beyond urban areas, but I'll try and give you a brief introduction to where we are in this review of the legislation and make some specific reference to the provisions for specific areas which would include urban areas. So I don't want to go too much into detail in the background, but just to set the background that we have two targets that are related targets under the Farm to Fork strategy released in May 2020. The most important being the reduction by 50% in the overall use and risk of chemical pesticides, and then a related target to specifically reduce by 50% the more hazardous pesticides, the so-called candidates for substitution. These are a range of targets. There are other biodiversity strategy targets as well, which are the same. There's a related target to increase organic farming area, which also should affect. I ought to stress at the moment, these targets set the political framework. They're forward-looking, they're ambitious, but they're not legally binding. They're aspirational targets that are supposed to set the direction as to where we want to be by 2030. But announced at the same time are a number of actions related to these targets, and the two most important related actions are the revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive from 2009, and the production of 4 implementing regulations to facilitate and speed up the putting on the market of biological active substances, microbial active substances. Now, the publication date for the Sustainable Use of Pesticides regulation, we're not supposed to say that, but I've said it now, is last week. It was unfortunately delayed from the announced publication date because of a need to take urgent and radical action in relation to the Ukraine. This doesn't mean it's postponed. We are looking for a new date, which we are told will be before the summer, and hopefully it'll be earlier rather than later. But I can't tell you the new date because I don't know what it is myself yet. This is being discussed obviously by our political hierarchy, and we hope that it'll be brought to a date that's as soon as possible. What this means is that unfortunately, when I said I could speak at this seminar, I thought I would have the legal text in front of me and would be able to share with you the legal text. Unfortunately, because it's not published, I can't give you the exact text, and I have to be a little bit cautious in giving exact wording, but I'll try and give you some indication as to our thinking and direction in the new legislation. So if we then look at specifically the urban area situation, why is that important? Well, first of all, let's start with what it says at the moment. The current legislation is, first of all, a directive, which means that the application has been very variable. And particularly in the case of the actions on reduction of pesticide use and risk in specific areas, including urban areas, places where the public are, have been very localized. So there's lots of good practice examples, which are very often limited to cities or regions, but we don't see uniform application, even in the same member state or in the same region. We see working very well in some areas, depending on the presence of people with political will to do something about it, and not very well in other areas where there isn't somebody driving that. So it's not uniformly applied. And one of the intentions in the new legislation for all of the policy areas is to make the legislation more directly applicable and therefore to have less variation in the application. We also want to move towards this being something that's legally binding and is applicable and is not then subject to variation through transposition. Now, I haven't put the full text here, but suffice to say that the current Article 12, which is reduction of pesticide use or risk in specific areas, didn't come out well in the negotiations in 2009. The wording is very vague and is open to a degree of interpretation. Now, I mean, I can read you the whole text, but the key important texts are that the use of pesticides is minimized or prohibited in certain specific areas. So minimize could mean I reduce slightly from a very high level, but I still have a very high level of application, and legally it's complied with. And it also says risk management measures should be taken, the use of low risk should be considered in the first place, all which seems to give a framework to use pesticides, providing you can demonstrate you've considered something else in the first instance. So we've been quite critical of member states' application of this provision, but to a certain extent, to a large extent, it's because the wording is not very precise, it's not very prescriptive, and it's open to interpretation. So yes, so we need to work on improving that current definition. There we go. So how are these specific areas defined? Well, in the current legislation, there are 3 bullets for these specific areas. The first of these is areas used by general public or vulnerable groups, and vulnerable groups is defined in 1107, the pesticide legislation. And this covers parks, sports grounds, schools, playgrounds, and proximity to healthcare facilities. Again, not very precise, open to interpretation. Does it include pavements? Does it include roads? It's written very much as being green areas the way it's written. So some people interpret it as being green areas, some people interpret it more widely. There are ecologically sensitive areas, protected areas under water legislation and the habitats directives. And then there's a line that, to be honest, nobody has ever explained to me. Recently treated areas used by or accessible to agricultural workers. So I'm not really sure what that means. I'd be glad if somebody could explain it to me, because nobody's yet managed to explain the logic of that bullet to me. So we are at the end of the process of revising this piece of legislation. We've been through extensive consultation. The examples of the consultations are here. And we've had quite extensive input regarding sensitive areas, particularly concerning biodiversity, pollinators, as well as regarding cities and proximity to humans. So there's various representations being made during this process, specifically looking at tightening up on the definition of the specific areas from the existing legislation. Just to say that when we do get to the publication date, and I can't give you the date because I don't know it, the legal text will be published along with an explanatory memorandum and associated impact assessment, staff working documents and documents. So the whole thing will be published in one draft. Some of the main and important policy areas that have been looked at in the review. The first is to align the legislation, the new regulation, to the farm to fork strategy. So here we want to make the targets binding, both at an EU and a member state level, allowing member states to take on board the specific situations of the member states. And we also consider that member states can and should set additional targets to help meet those targets. So one of those might be that they set targets specific to non-agricultural areas or urban areas or cities, or however they want to define it, because we know that probably around 10–15%, we don't have the exact figures, 10–15% of pesticide use is non-agricultural. So it's an important area that member states should be looking at. And then we look at provisions to strengthen the current provisions, and these are some examples, IPM, but here we also have specific areas where we know that the implementation has not been as effective as it should have been. Okay, so with the proviso that I can't give you what wording is in there, I think there's a number of issues that we have to deal with in trying to strengthen the provisions. The first of these is to try and be precise on the definition of the sensitive areas or the specific areas that are covered by the legislation. Generally speaking, these fall into three categories: public, so where the public are, vulnerable groups, and ecologically sensitive areas. Ecologically sensitive areas would cover proximity to watercourses, it would cover Habitats Directive, Natura 2000, but also sensitive areas for pollinators. So we will look at defining and extending the ecologically sensitive provision. The public and vulnerable groups, we are trying our best to be precise. It's very difficult, it's not easy. And we know France has been trying its best to reach this definition. We were hoping they would reach a definition first, but they didn't come up with one. We've been looking closely at the land classification system, Copernicus, held by the European Commission, to try and define the specific categories which will enable a local planning, a local authority or a competent authority to define what should and shouldn't be covered by this. The second consideration is the scope of the ban. So do we ban everything, all pesticides, or do we ban everything but low risk? Do we ban chemical? Do we ban synthetic? Do we ban the more hazardous pesticides? Difficult question, but we have to make a decision as to what is included in the ban within these areas. We're constantly told there is a need for derogations, that there are currently some situations where invasive pest species, there's no other alternative but to use pesticides in certain areas. well, if that is the case, we need a system of derogations, but we need to be very prescriptive that this is a last course action. It should be limited, it should be very controlled, and we don't want to word it so that member states can then use this derogation routinely and end up by default routinely applying pesticides where they shouldn't. And the other question then is, do we include a buffer zone for these areas? And if so, what buffer zone do we include? So those, again, I'm sorry I can't give you the exact wording, but those are really the issues that legally we're struggling with and trying to deal with in defining and making more precise the provisions regarding, well, regarding sensitive areas as a whole, but also regarding urban areas. Other questions might be, do you include watercourses in urban areas? What about, these are all examples that have been given to us and we're trying to legally define them. What about watercourses? What about urban farms? What about private gardens? What about private gardens that people can visit, but they're not paying? Lots of questions to try and define what is and isn't covered, which we have to deal with. Just to stress that the review of the sustainable...
Andrew, would you be able to wrap it up very quickly?
Yes.
So we can move on to the next speaker.
Sorry,
thanks.
I get a bit bit carried away. Just to say that these actions are not in isolation. There's a lot of other strategies that link into the actions on the sustainable use of pesticides. We hope we will have a date soon, and then we can go through to the council working groups and the parliament discussions. We look forward to that, and trust we have your support in these next steps. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Andrew. And without any further ado, we'll pass over to Peter Hagemeyer, who's going to give us his take on what's happening with Pesticide-Free Towns. Peter.
Yes, I share my screen. So I hope everybody can see the full screen and can hear my voices. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to tell you about the current state of the subject in the Netherlands. Thank you for joining us, and good to see so many people editing. Yeah, the topic is incredibly important. It is also one first step we needed to take with urgency. Push the button for the next slide. Page 2, okay. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Peter Hagemeyer. At Ecoconsult, I work as a project leader on projects in the field of soil, water and environmental related issues. And because behind my work, I can often be found on and around the water. In my presentation, I will briefly talk about the following topics and only have limited time for this. You can already give a complete presentation on every topic. To begin, what was happening in the past, the history. We have been working on this subject in the Netherlands for about 35 years now. The discussion about chemical-free management dates from before the ministry drew up a multi-year plan for crop propagation in 1989. We've included a reduction in consumption. A lot has happened in the years that followed. The change was quickly made for public green spaces. For pavements, it was mainly the development of machines and equipment that always ensure the change. Since 2016, municipalities have been banned from chemical weed control on paved surfaces, and since 2017 also in green areas. For sport fields, the Green Deal sport provides the chemistry will remain available for a number of situations until 2022. In recent years, the authorities, the market and the trade associations have working well together with yielding good results. It has been proven in all circumstances that sport fields management without chemicals is briefly possible. The ban on use primarily based on restoring the quality of surface water. And the second important agreement is concern for the production of safe drinking water from surface water and the risk of public health. The ban finally gave a long-awaited clarity. The water quality, surface water and groundwater has improved since 2016 and is more in line with the objective of the Water Framework Directive. This is the positive effect of stopping the use of pesticides of pavements and in green spaces. The use of chemical pesticides destroys the build-up soil quality in one fell swoop and requires years of recovery. Also, local use and small amount of pesticides also ensure that a complete and a good change cannot be made. At least a quarter of all biodiversity lives underground. However, soil life is under pressure in the Netherlands. We still know very little about the soil health in public spaces. In rural areas, this is already further, but I will not focus on that now. Chemical products are the reason that the ecosystem in the soil is changed. As a result, plants can absorb fewer nutrients and are therefore more susceptible to disasters. You can also see the use of the pesticides is a kind of downward spiral. This has adverse effect on, for example, the sponge effect of the soil in urban areas, and the climate adaptation. Soil is essential for properly functioning water and nutrient cycles and the healed soil. After years of application of pesticides, in many cases, a kind of translation period is necessary. Restoration of the natural balance is needed, and after 3 to 5 months, no pesticides and nitrate phosphate development of microsoil life started again. And after 2 years, most soils are stable. Okay, and each placental organic matter already retains 5 millimeters of soil moisture. With the soil in order, you will suffer less from diseases and ailments. When you switching to 100% organic fertilizing, a translation period will necessary depending on the soil situation. There must be a shift in urban planning. It is necessary for developers and builders pay more attention to the soil. About a quarter of biodiversity lives underground. And many people have now realized that climate adaptive and nature inclusive construction, the soil, should not be forgotten. How do we go on? Huh? What's the next step? Getting the last municipalities along the translation. Not all municipalities are ready yet. Also included sports and recreation under the ban and guide the sector throughout the translation. And last but not least, more awareness and information towards the society and residents. The goal to keep biodiversity above and below in order and just to realize the healthy and climate robust living environment. We still know very little about the soil health in urban areas. The situation in Europe we are now in will also push climate measures into a further downward spiral if we do not take the ban further. By advancing the ban on crop protection and the Green Deal right now, we are creating a better condition in both rural and the urban areas. And let the current crisis be a lesson that Europe must become less dependent on imports of raw materials from non-EU countries. And moving the ban forward is the first step we needed to take. I realized that many subjects have been discussed in outline. If further information is required, please contact me, send me an email or something. And for now, thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was quite informative, and it raises a number of questions, which I'm sure we can move on to later, or that people can contact you outside of the forum. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, Carolin Guilleban. And Carolin, if you could take the stage, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David, for welcoming me for this webinar. And I'm very happy to be with you all this afternoon. I will share my screen, and I hope this will work. Is it okay for you? Okay. Thank you. So I'm very happy to be with you all this afternoon because I would like to share with you some inspiring example that we have in France about pesticide-free towns. First, I start introducing myself. So I'm Carolin Guilleban. I'm an engineer from the French Public Institute of Landscape and Horticulture in France, in Angers, and I'm specialized in plant protection and pesticide-free practices. Since 2006, I'm the director of Plant and City, which is a technical center dedicated to research and experiment about urban greening, green space, and nature in cities. We gather more than 600 members, mainly city councils, landscape companies, and research institutes. And our mission are to carry out research on technical issues such as ecological practices for open space maintenance or nature-based solutions for renaturing cities, as well as plant diversity towards climate change and biodiversity loss, but also soil protection and ecological urbanism. So pesticide-free towns is obviously an very important topic. And from our experience, it can be the first step to act on environmental issues in public open space, because having nice green space or beautiful landscapes or green corridors is not enough to enhance biodiversity if we don't consider the maintenance practices of these spaces. So pesticide-free practices is a mean to drive biodiversity policies at a local scale. Secondly, it's about people's health. Nature in cities is more and more considered as a promising infrastructure for health and well-being. And if they are well designed, green space can also have lots of benefits, like improving air quality, providing microclimate regulation, or enhancing safety, social integration, and public health. So in that perspective, it's difficult to imagine the use of pesticide in places designed and offered to the public for their health attributes. Let's imagine in this park in Bordeaux, if workers had sprayed pesticide for weed control on the lawns with all the people laying on. It's a matter of coherence. And now I'm going to tell you how pesticide-free practices are possible, because they are. Over the last 15 years, there have been a lot of studies and researches and experiments to find alternatives to pesticide for green space maintenance. And here are some examples of alternatives that are quite common practice today in many cities in France. So first, it can be greening, sodding, or planting instead of weeding. Or it can be weeding and the vegetation control, but with alternatives methods like hot water, gas, or weed whacker, and many other innovating approaches, sometimes more expensive, it's true, or with other ecological impacts. So it's important for cities to find the techniques that fit their own needs. We have also worked on biocontrol solutions like pheromone traps, natural solution with biocontrol antagonists to control the pest population. And although every method is not a full success, it's very important, it's worthy to combine themselves to find a kind of happy medium and to maintain the pest population beneath a critical threshold. But one of the key lessons of our research was that knowledge is a very important driver of weeds acceptance. For instance, in a study that we carried out a few years ago in field surveys, we noticed that people who could name the weeds had a greater positive opinion on them and was more able to accept wider landscapes. This picture is interesting because it illustrates an initiative from an artist in Nantes, in France. She used to name the weeds in the street to help people to change their point of view about what is really dirty or what is just wild. And this is very interesting. Pesticide-free towns is also possible if we re-question the practices. Why weeding is so important, and how did our grandparents before the 60s and the generalization of pesticide? This is very interesting in the case of cemeteries. Until a few years ago, cemeteries in France were like the picture you saw, you can see on the right, mineral and impervious. But 60 years ago, cities like Rennes didn't weed their cemetery, and this is the picture on the left. Instead, they used to give vouchers to farmers so that they can harvest the hay in the cemetery. We had completely forgotten that cemeteries could have that kind of landscape and that it was okay for the people. So the standards which we are used to nowadays are completely different, with zero weed in pathway and graves. But fortunately, the things are deeply changing in France, where cemeteries are much greener today with the ban of pesticide in 2017. The new zero weed practices can have impressive landscape impact. Here is an example of a small town in another city. On the picture on the left, the cemetery was a kind of stereotype of French cemeteries. And on the second picture, in the same place, you can see that the massive changes had been done in order to stop pesticide are really great looking. And in that particular case, the vegetation helped to solve water management issues in the cemetery plots. So I think that this transformation is very representative of all the efforts done by professional and city councils in France over the last 15 years to redesign places, to build new landscapes and to make people accept them. Of course, it's crucial to help workers and public servants to change their practices. So we've produced a lot of guidelines, tools, and technical references, and we've gathered many sources of inspiration in terms of communication, as the one you can see on the right. It's really part of our job to do that, especially in places where it's hard to change our point of view, like in cemeteries and for sport fields. But a town is not a sum of public open spaces, and we all know that pesticides don't stop to the limit of the plots where they're sprayed. You can see here a map of a small city having parks, green space, cemeteries, sports field, but also railways, roads, industrial plots, and fields for agriculture. In the actual regulation, there is 1/3 of the area where pesticides are totally banned. This can be seen with the green. But with the next regulation, next July, it will go up to 50%. And so for the other 50%, we are carrying out a study to find what could be the means of action of local governments to limit the impact of pesticide on the neighboring, and to encourage pesticide-free practices by other land managers. So it's probably dealing with urban planning, urban layouts, and cooperation framework with other stakeholders. And so to conclude, here are 5 ideas to take home with you. First is that pesticides have not always been used by the people, by the workers, to maintain public open space, and that prior generations were used to having more wild vegetation in towns. Second is that pesticide-free strategy is not only a question of pesticide substitution with alternatives. Third is that knowledge is a very important driver of weeds acceptance in public open space, as we learned from social studies. Next is that pesticide-free strategy is an opportunity to redesign open space and to consider other ecological practices like water or soil management that play a role to enhance ecosystemic services. And at last, the thing is that next steps will be to consider the blind spots of regulation and find tools to help local governments to go further. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Caroline. That was really quite interesting, particularly some of those perceptions of what we thought the past was, and it's not really that. What I would like to do is to now introduce one of also continue the French sort of connection here and move to Marianne Lefebvre, who will give us an introduction as to what also is happening in France.
Good afternoon. Can you put the slides full screen, please? Okay, thanks. So I'm Marianne Lefebvre, assistant professor in economics at Angers University, and I'm presenting today joint work with a colleague from Plantécité, where Carolin Guilleban is also working, and other colleagues from my university. So we've ran a survey in 2017, quite a big one. And our question was, to what extent French people accept the transition to pesticide-free urban green spaces that was compulsory from 2017, at least in the parks and gardens that we've investigated. And we wanted to compare the opinions of the citizens, but also the managers in charge of these areas and the local politicians. So next, please. So what is at stake here is that, as Caroline just mentioned, some technical solutions are available to manage these areas without pesticides, but they induce changes. for the users and the workers. And there are received opinions from those that take the decisions, so mostly the local politicians and the managers, on whether these changes are acceptable by the citizens. So the next slide, please. Our objective was to challenge these received opinions with regard to what changes are acceptable by the users, and to identify how the transition to pesticide-free can be implemented. So the question here was not whether banning pesticide would be beneficial for the population, because that was decided that it would be the case anyway in France, but how to implement this transition so that it increases the welfare, the well-being for the majority of the citizens. So how did we do that? Next slide, please. So the first question was, what are the likely consequences of the adaptation of these areas to allow their management without pesticides? So to do that, we did interviews with mostly with managers in charge of these areas. And then we moved to the next question, which is, which one of these consequences are the most valued and disliked by the citizens? And the third question is, do we observe any divergence across stakeholders? Do they agree on what is important for them? So going into the details, you can see on the small pictures, what are these consequences? What are these aspects of the urban green spaces that are most likely to be impacted if we move to a management without pesticides? So the first one you may think about is the visual aspect, so more wild, more natural aspect. We could think also about having more fauna, but this may also impact the recreational opportunities that could be improved if there's some investment to improve them, or deteriorated. For example, if the grass is higher, then it may not be as so easy to run for the kids to play and so on. Also, we've seen in France that when there were a lot of information campaign in the parks and training for the workers, because this is quite a big change for the workers and their working condition can be impacted. So we were interested to know whether the citizens are aware of that, and if they care about the working conditions of the workers. They may see when they visit these parks and gardens, and also some financial impacts. So to do that, next one, please. Yes. So we used a method. I'm not going into the details, but basically it's a survey, and people have to choose which park they would prefer, and we define the different parks. So here, for example, you have a park that is named A1 versus another park with other characteristics. So both are managed without pesticides, and you have to decide which one you would prefer, which transition you would prefer. And we asked you this question several times, and we can infer from that what do you prefer? And if you had to pay, because for the management of these parks, we used the public budget. So if we have to use part of the public budget, the city budget for that, what do you prefer? So we've interviewed, so it was in the winter 2017. So in theory, the pesticide ban was effective everywhere in France, but we know that it was not the case in all the cities. Also, some cities had implemented the ban a long time before the law. So that was quite interesting, this heterogeneity. And we surveyed on one hand 500 citizens, representative for the French population, but also another sample where we had citizens again, but also managers and local politicians. So going to the results, so what we observed, so next slide, please. What we observe. So from citizen point of view, the most important thing is, first, do not deteriorate the recreational opportunities and do not deteriorate the working conditions of the workers. So it seems that citizens do care about the workers, because usually they work during the opening hours of the park, so their work is quite visible. And that's an issue we've discussed quite a lot, that when they were using pesticides, the spraying, well, of course, they were usually not done during the opening hours, but even with their specific equipment, protection equipment, this was, they always had a lot of questions by the users of the visitors of the park. So we've seen that French people do care about the working conditions, and it's important not to deteriorate them. We've seen that the recreational opportunities is very important. So if in these transitions to pesticide-free management, the city councils can find a way to improve these opportunities, this is something that is very valued by the population. The fact that more fauna can be observed is also something very important. That people do not dislike the natural wild aspects. They are more in favor of that, more than a control aspect. And also, this was quite surprising for us, they do not value that much the presence of information explaining what is the pesticide ban and how do we manage without pesticides. So this could be because maybe they already had access to this information in France, but also we think that's a received opinion from the manager that it's very important to inform the population, but maybe the population is more interested in having some recreational opportunities than knowing how the park is managed. So we should be cautious to think whether it's so important to invest part of the budget in this information campaign. So then what we've done here, next slide please, is that we've compared different scenarios. So imagine a scenario where you organize the transition. So we call it apparently as before. So basically it consists in keeping unchanged the recreational opportunities, the visual aspects and the fauna abundance as before the pesticide ban. But this necessarily comes at the cost of deteriorated working conditions because workers will have to work much more. For example, if you think for weeding, it takes much more time, and the alternative equipments can be heavy to carry and so on. So what we estimate here is that for this scenario to receive the support of the majority of the population, we would need to reduce the budget allocated to urban green space by 11 percentage points. So it means that people would agree for this scenario, but only if it costs less, which is unlikely to happen because weeding without pesticide takes more time, and the labor cost is one of the major financial aspects of these parks and gardens management. So an alternative scenario would be the laissez-faire. So basically is to limit the maintenance burden in the absence of pesticide. So with more wide-looking area, most likely with deteriorated recreational opportunities. So fauna could be happy, so major increase in fauna abundance. But we inform the population because it's quite a big change in the visual aspects of this area. In that case, we could imagine that the working condition could be improved because, well, we don't ask so much manual or thermic or whatever other weeding techniques to the workers. So in that case, we observe that, well, basically half of the population would be happy with this scenario, but half not. The scenario that was more convincing for the population, it's the new opportunity one. So the idea here is that—
Marianne, can we wrap it up, please?
Yeah. So this scenario, why is it, it makes people more happy. So basically they would be willing to pay more to have more of the city budget dedicated to urban green space because the recreational opportunities are improved. And this is very important for the people. So the last point is, do we have a divergence in the preferences of the different population, the different stakeholders? So they basically agree on many dimensions. They all agree on the importance of not deteriorating the recreational opportunities and the working conditions. But what is interesting here is that it's more important for the citizens, the wild aspect on the presence of fauna than for the others. So it's a received opinion that citizens won't accept more wild aspects. It's on the contrary, they accept it more than the politicians and the managers. And also the importance of information. this is not so important for the citizens, but it's very important for the managers, because we believe that they want to show that they do efforts to manage without pesticide, and they want to show and communicate it to the public. So that's human. I think that's always nice to share what you do with the others, but it's also costly. So maybe that's not so important according to result to invest in this information campaign. Okay, so if you want more information on this study, so maybe you can directly move to the last slide. We have an article already published in French, and 2 will be forthcoming soon in English. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Marianne. That's very interesting, and I'm sure people will go there. I know that he's pressed for time, so I ask Francois Villeret from Generation Future to give his insight on things. Francois?
Hello, I hope you can hear me well. Okay, so I'm standing in a public park in Colmar, Eastern France. Here you can see a nice bit of wildflowers, nice bit of mulching also, and kids playing just by where I stand. So this is a nice setting to tell you a few words on what happened in France on pesticide use suppression or quasi-suppression in public places. Well, as was said just before, many towns started, stopping using pesticides years ago, like Rennes, Nantes, Versailles, Beauvais, and many others. I'm sure I miss many of them. But in 2014, we had a very good opportunity with a Green senator here, Senator Joël Labbé, to have a new law passed. He managed to build a strong coalition, strong political coalition around him, with people for every political parties. And his law that now bears his name was voted and started to bear fruits in 2017. First effect, that was the major one. As of the 1st of January 2017, the use of synthetic pesticides was suppressed, was forbidden in green spaces, forests, walks, accessible to the public, which is the main part of his plan. And 2 years after, it was also planned to ban the possibility for individuals, gardeners, private gardeners to use synthetic pesticides also in their own garden. So this was the start of a very strong movement here. A very important law that was passed with a few derogations though for products that are biocontrol methods, products used for organic farming or low-risk pesticides as defined by the regulation of 2009. And a few other derogations were also granted to control specific pests, as we can qualify them, that could endanger specific gardens or of high interest. But still, a few measures needed to be added to this first effort. And it was made recently and planned for the 1st of July of this year with an official text that will protect all the other places that are used by the public. And there are many, many of them that were not protected yet. And the ban will be extended to all the properties, all the residential properties, which is very important because the Labbé law didn't have any effect in common properties. It was absolutely with no effect on that. Now it's going to be the case, and in collective properties you won't be able to use synthetic pesticides either. Health institutions, academic institutions will also be concerned by this restriction, by this ban of pesticides. All the zones dedicated to the public, for tourism, for commerce, for service, and also for working places will be also touched by this new text as of the 1st of July 2022. That means that, the places where welcoming the public, where the use of pesticides will be allowed are, it's getting smaller and smaller, very few of them now. Another specific sort of places is cemeteries also that are going to be concerned by this end of pesticide use. Very interesting, as was shown before. It's sometimes difficult to make people understand that it's not because you have grass in cemeteries that you don't respect the dead, but it's a cultural aspect, and it needs, explanations from the local authorities, but it does work very well where it has been experimented before. Another place where, stopping the use of pesticides can be problematic is sports fields, because, sportsmen, footballers and so on, they love to have, perfect green to play on, but still it's now included in the places where the use of pesticides is going to be forbidden, except for, the highest division playgrounds, where first or second division, where there is a derogation. And also other places like golf courses, tennis courts, and hippodromes are going to be also forbidden, the pesticide there, but a bit later on, as of 20 and 25, which is in 3 years' time. So, little by little, the use of pesticides is getting more or less forbidden everywhere, with a few derogations remaining, but in fact, very little. And as you can see here, it's not looking like a jungle, people are staying, playing and walking. It's very nice and lively, and we are safe from any toxic chemicals. So it is feasible wherever you stand in the country now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francois. It's very interesting seeing you there, actually in the park, delivering your talk. Much appreciated. Thank you. And we'll let you get off and do what else you have to do at the moment. We've got one more speaker, people, before we move across to hear the reactions and debate from our MEPs. But if I can hand over to Eduardo Prestanti, and Eduardo is coming from Italy for us, and we do have the translation available for this talk.
Hello, I'm Fulvia. Major Eduardo Prestanti is not with us yet, has not joined us yet, so we have to wait a little bit.
Fulvia, do you have an understanding as to when that may be?
Oh, he told us about 10 minutes.
10 minutes from now?
I think he's on the way. Okay.
Right. We can't really just sit and wait for that 10 minutes.
Yes.
What we will do, I think, is if our MEP, Eleonora Evi, is there, we might see if we can get the reactions from her at the moment. I see you there, Eleonora. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. And if you could please give us your feeling of what's happening or what needs to happen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me tell you that I'm particularly happy to be present to participate to this webinar, because I really found all those virtuous examples of pesticide-free towns, showing that another possibility, another way of doing things is already taking place in Europe, albeit with a lot of efforts, a lot of not without obstacles, and not without the ability of people to have a far-looking sight, which is exactly what we need today in this moment, in order to really make those steps forward to realize concretely this ecological transition that we desperately need to make it happen as soon as possible. And I really found very important, and the European network of Pesticide-Free Towns is really making a valuable work, also because it makes local administrators to exchange their experiences and best practices, and this is so important today. But really, the main point here is that that I get is that things are moving and are moving in the good and right direction, and therefore it is possible to move in this good and right direction. But I want also to make a major critic here, because as the representative from the Commission have said, unfortunately, the new proposal of the revision of the Sustainable Use Directive, which hopefully will be a regulation, has been postponed. And actually, for us, for the Greens, this has been a very disappointing information and action, and we wrote to we have been writing to the President von der Leyen to show it, to express our deep disappointment and outrage because of this postponement of this proposal. Why? Because we don't have time to waste. We have to go on with the sustainable goals that are present in the Green Deal, namely the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy are pillars of the ecological transition, and we cannot really waste more time. And the major point I want to make here today is also the fact that with these the current situation, this horrible war that has been initiated by Putin in Ukraine, and this situation is used in a cynical way, in my opinion, to postpone all the efforts and decisions that has to be made at European level in order to advance on the ecological transition, that are part of the solution if we want really honestly tackling the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis out there, which are crises that are not stopping. And the IPCC report that has been released just a few weeks ago and has been unfortunately basically ignored by the public because, of course, this major shock that we are all very worried about of the war in Ukraine. But hey, this report is telling us again that the window of opportunity to change our policies and to change our economy is really closing, and it makes this report again a strong call on the transformation of the agricultural sector, which is of course part of the solution, and the use of pesticides is here of course playing a crucial role in destroying either climate and biodiversity. So what is now really important to me is not stopping the release of the proposals, because not only the Sustainable Use of Pesticide Directive has been postponed, but also the nature restoration has been postponed, and we don't know now when the proposal will be released. And what is also worse in here is that, for example, the revision of the Sustainable Use Directive was basically finalized. So this postponement we could also run the risk to give more time to weaken the draft. And this could also be a major threat we are encountering. So just to close the message here, I want to recall again the strong support from citizens and from the public that has been shown also, for example, in the European citizen initiatives, Save Bees and Farmers. More than 1 million citizens have signed these initiatives, testifying and really expressing a strong support in the transformation of the agricultural sector that has to become a sustainable one, with a reduction, a strong reduction in the use of pesticide, but also, of course, keeping in mind that farmers and nature can work together and have to work together. So thank you very much for this valuable input, and let's stay bold and attentive about the next steps that will be crucial for the redesign of our agricultural policies.
Thank you very much, Eleonora, and thank you for co-hosting the event for us, but also for your insight there and for your taking the floor when we were waiting for the other speaker. He has now joined us, and so we have our mayor from Italy, Edoardo Prestanti, that's going to join us. And as I said before, there you can listen to this in Italian or in English via the translation service. So I hand over to Edoardo.
Allora, buon pomeriggio a tutti, mi presento molto velocemente, sono Edoardo Prestanti, sindaco di Carmignano, una piccola città, un piccolo comune vicino a Firenze. E da qualche anno abbiamo aderito alle città libere dai pesticidi e la nostra adesione si va a configurare in una strategia di gestione sostenibile del nostro verde pubblico, ma anche condivisa con tutti gli operatori agricoli e non, per garantire una gestione appunto sostenibile ed ecologica del nostro territorio. Perfetto. Carmignano, un territorio in cammino per una comunità sostenibile. Carmignano, terra antica, ricca di acqua e di generosa natura, terra contesa dai tempi antichi, che custodisce come un prezioso scrigno tutte le ricchezze storiche, artistiche ed astronomiche che hanno fatto e fanno grande la nostra regione nel mondo. Carmignano è oggi un comune moderno, aperto al futuro, che non dimentica le sue origini ed il suo passato. Il territorio di Carmignano vanta 3.000 anni di storia ininterrotta, le cui tracce sono testimonianze preziose di popoli, arte e conoscenza, da diffondere e far conoscere. Ma le sfide future ci chiedono di ripensare il modo di riqualificare l'esistente e progettare gli spazi futuri per garantire la necessaria resilienza ai mutamenti climatici e per rigenerare il patrimonio esistente e cogliere le opportunità di sviluppo economico. Un futuro sostenibile passa dalla cura dei beni comuni e dalla promozione di buone pratiche. Nell'epoca del Covid appare imprescindibile la tutela dell'ambiente, come tutela della salute umana. Ambiente, salute, lavoro, scuola, acqua, gestione dei rifiuti, prevenzione del rischio idrogeologico non sono un arroccamento ideologico di un presente troppo spesso chiuso nello stanco rito del non c'è alternativa, ma una nuova visione di futuro diretta verso il pieno compimento dei valori costituzionali alla base della nostra Repubblica. I passi verso un futuro sostenibile. Abbiamo avviato un percorso per la realizzazione di un'alleanza fra i protagonisti dello sviluppo locale, agricoltori, associazioni, amministratori e cittadini. Un patto per lo sviluppo sostenibile locale, che si chiama Biodistretto, verso una gestione multifunzionale del territorio che, partendo dall'agricoltura biologica, prosegue nel recupero della campagna giardino, nel turismo sostenibile e nella rigenerazione urbana. Il primo passo è stato lo stop al glifosato, un percorso politico e amministrativo condiviso con agricoltori e associazioni che ci ha portato all'ordinanza di divieto assoluto su tutto il territorio, sia aree pubbliche e private, nell'utilizzo di erbicidi contenenti il glifosato. In tale contesto, in collaborazione con i ricercatori di Next Genomics, abbiamo promosso il progetto GlifoB, monitoraggio ambientale della presenza di glifosato e AMPA su api mellifere e acque di superficie nel comune di Carmignano e nei territori limitrofi. Il secondo passo, gestione sostenibile del verde e disinfestazione biologica. In questo processo di transizione ecologica, il ruolo del pubblico come promotore, come esempio, deve essere centrale, Per tali motivi abbiamo previsto un regolamento comunale per la gestione del verde pubblico e privato e per la sostenibilità ambientale, che prevede una gestione totalmente biologica del verde pubblico. Nelle aree pubbliche, infatti, sono già stati banditi tutti i pesticidi. Negli spazi privati abbiamo messo al bando per adesso solo il glifosato. Per le aree pubbliche non ci siamo limitati al divieto di utilizzo di pesticidi, ma abbiamo adottato una strategia ecologica sia nella gestione delle malerbe, assumendo un nuovo giardiniere e rinnovando il parco mezzi, oltre a utilizzare prodotti ecologici, ma ci siamo spinti anche utilizzando l'arredo urbano e giochi in materiali ecocompatibili e materiali riciclati, ma anche con interventi di disinfestazione per zanzare e topi completamente biologici. Siamo il primo comune della Toscana a utilizzare prodotti repellenti a base di una miscela di rosmarino e aglio, mettendo al bando i prodotti larvicidi e adulticidi. In tale ambito abbiamo promosso un incontro di frazione per la distribuzione di kit informativi e prodotti ecologici per tutta la cittadinanza. Abbiamo acquistato anche in dotazione dei mezzi quali pio di serbo e prodotti ecologici appunto per la gestione del verde, oltre all'assunzione aggiuntiva di un giardiniere necessario per la manutenzione ecologica del nostro verde pubblico. Il terzo passo è stato Carmignano 2020, un progetto di conversione ecologica mediante un protocollo d'intesa tra il comune e le associazioni locali, volto ad attivare un percorso fatto di sostegno agli agricoltori locali, approfondimento e studio e ricerca completamente gratuito per favorire la conversione ecologica sia delle aziende che dei singoli agricoltori, ma anche degli hobbyisti, concretizzato con alcuni importanti progetti, come l'istituzione di uno sportello verde al servizio di agricoltori, fornendo gratuitamente informazioni sulle coltivazioni, gli allevamenti, i prodotti fitosanitari e sui bandi regionali necessari per la crescita delle aziende agricole biologiche. La promozione di politiche di monitoraggio di comunità della muscole area al fine di rafforzare la difesa e la consapevolezza delle comunità di agricoltori. È stato redatto anche l'Atlante delle produzioni autoctone, naturali e tradizionali, dei servizi e dell'ecoturismo carmignanese per conoscere e preservare la biodiversità locale. Il quarto passo, ripubblicizzazione della mensa scolastica. Una scelta politica con cui non solo abbiamo voluto ripubblicizzare il servizio, ma abbiamo deciso di farlo con la società che è considerata la migliore azienda di ristorazione scolastica della Toscana. Nella scelta, che abbiamo maturato nel tempo, ha avuto valore fondamentale il fatto che qualità e servizi si serva solo di produttori locali di fiducia. Tornare al pubblico era per il comune di Carmignano fondamentale, ma non sufficiente. Occorreva una sintonia sul concetto di educazione alimentare e rispetto dell'ambiente. Una conferma che trova riscontro nelle buone pratiche a cui si ispira anche Slow Food, ovvero un cibo che sia buono, pulito e giusto, e che si pone come obiettivo la creazione di una comunità del cibo, custode di biodiversità e sovranità alimentare, tenendo le nostre risorse nei nostri territori. Un'anticipazione della strategia europea chiamata Farm to Fork, declinata nella piana fiorentina. Il quinto passo, l'efficientamento di tutta la pubblica illuminazione. Sono stati sostituiti tutti i punti luce, ricorrendo al LED, con abbattimento di 2/3 della CO2, con un miglioramento del potere illuminante ed un conseguente risparmio energetico ed economico. Uno di questi casi in cui vince l'ambiente, ma vince anche l'economia. Il sesto passo, faremo foresta, progetto di piantumazione e riforestazione urbana. Prevediamo 4 progetti specifici in 4 aree diverse, con lo scopo di bilanciare la produzione di CO2 e raggiungere la neutralità climatica. Il settimo passo, le vie dell'acqua e la mobilità sostenibile. Abbiamo effettuato una serie di interventi sui fiumi in cui si unisce la rigenerazione dei nostri corsi d'acqua con il recupero delle pescaie e dell'habitat fluviale, tipico dei nostri luoghi, con delle moderne piste ciclopedonali con valenza di mobilità sostenibile, ma anche quale percorso turistico che rilega le trame di un territorio fatte di bellezze storiche, naturalistiche e gastronomiche. L'ultimo passo, l'ottavo, verso il distretto biologico del Montalbano. A compimento dei passi fatti finora, il prossimo obiettivo sarà quello di aderire in modo ufficiale al percorso di riconoscimento del distretto biologico come previsto dalla legge della Regione Toscana. Concludo, la vera forza di una comunità è poter sviluppare la responsabilità della propria salute, facendosi custodi del proprio ambiente interno ed esterno, riconoscendo di essere interconnessi e parte di un ecosistema in grado di garantire benessere solo se tenuto in un equilibrio armonico. È stata la consapevolezza che l'agricoltura intensiva e chimica non può garantire il sostentamento futuro per la nostra agricoltura, per la nostra salute, per gli ecosistemi del nostro pianeta, a spingere il Comune di Carmignano a cambiare approccio verso una città sana e sostenibile. Vi ringrazio tutti per aver dato spazio al percorso che stiamo facendo da Carmignano e spero assieme a voi di poter portare avanti anche i passi successivi verso la sostenibilità ambientale e quindi verso la tutela del nostro ecosistema e della nostra salute. Grazie a tutti per lo spazio che ci avete concesso.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eduardo, and also thanks, Fulvia, for the translation. For those of us who were listening to it in English rather than the original Italian. So our other MEP, Crystal Sheldamus, has unfortunately taken ill and will not be joining us. That's why I was a bit more relaxed on the time than I would otherwise have been. So I'm going to attempt to give some conclusions here, and then we also will see whether Eleonora, you'd like to respond on anything then as our host as well. But if I take your point to start with about the SUR being a pillar of our ecological transition, and it needs it to be a regulation, not a directive, for that to take place. I think Andrew gave us enough confidence earlier in his presentation that he said it was a regulation and we'd heard it here. So I think that that's enough for me, that I can regard that as being a regulation now. We've heard that today. But also, I take your other point that cynical postponements should not derail. We have a serious situation with the Ukraine, as you say, but it should not derail other serious long-term issues. They are part of the solution, as you said, not a problem that needs to be pushed aside as we deal with one. They can be dealt with together. So I think that that was sorry, I was muted there for some reason. The soil is very important, and urban planning is also part of that as we go forward, that we need to make sure that we're bringing the soil into it and recognizing its importance. The use and value of public spaces and the perception of the past. We can all have a rosy glow of what we thought we knew from the past, but it often isn't as we remembered it. That it's been the recent past that we're looking at, not the longer term that we're remembering as we go forward. European citizens' initiatives have been launched, and more than 1.3 million have asked for a pesticide-free future. I think this is absolutely important that we listen to those. Marianne stated that having interviewed over 1,000 citizens, that they point to life without pesticides as being important unanimously to them. and they are leading our policymakers and politicians. We should be taking notice of them, not worried about whether they will come along with us. They've clearly shown that that's what they want by the citizens' initiatives and also Marianne's interviews. And I can back that from my personal experience as a local councillor. And we are in a changing environment. We are looking for this ecological transition in our urban spaces at the moment. The other day, on Friday, there was a release of a call for organic awards with 5 categories, and those included towns and regions. Surely, from what we've heard today, it would be the perfect demonstration of towns worthy of an organic award, that they are moving down the track to becoming pesticides free. And I think that we should be taking note of that. And I will be making an approach towards that group that this should be recognized. The communication, though, needs to change. Weeds aren't our enemy. We can eat dandelions. They're quite tasty. They've got a mustardy flavor. Pollinators love them, as do young children, particularly blowing the dried seeds when they form that lovely, pretty head. But we looked at them as a menace. Why? They've got those brilliant, happy yellow flowers. They should be embraced, not shunned. So we look at things like the JRC, they're calling for behavioral change. And this can only happen if this communication changes, if we put a different message across. And so with that, I think that we do have a real start on this transition towards this ecological change that we're looking for these pesticide-free towns. So, Eleonora, would you like to respond with anything on that, please, as our host? And thank you very much for hosting this event today.
No, it's me that I thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all the speakers, the interventions. And I guess that it is so important that we continue to keep high the pressure and the attention on these topics. And in particular, because not only because we have to have strong and ambitious legislation in order to transform our goals into concrete piece of legislation, but then we have also to apply the legislation that we have. And in particular on these, one point that I forgot to mention before is that too many member states are still not behaving good in terms of applying the European laws. And this is also something very worrying, because if the national plans are still lacking or not present, or are delaying the measures, and so we don't have the figures and the picture of what is happening on the ground in terms of pesticide use, of course this is not good. And I find also unacceptable that many member states have not banned the use of pesticide in public areas so far. This is really something to me that is really incredible. In particular, children playgrounds or sideways or parks. So these are areas where we cannot put in danger the health of our children and the health of our citizens. And lately I submitted a written question to the European Commission to point out again these threats, where, for example, in many areas, nearly intensively managed agricultural areas where use of pesticide is huge, were contaminated. The areas, the nearby areas, public areas were contaminated with at least one pesticide residue. We cannot keep putting at risk the life of our children, as I said. So not only we have to have strong and ambitious legislation, but also we have to have the tools in order to control on the ground. And that's why anyway, these kind of meetings and events are so important to spread the knowledge that also alternatives and other ways to do it are possible and are already there. So thank you very much to the European Network of Pesticides Free Towns.
Thanks, Eleonora. And you raised a very important point there, that as we go forward, we do have to have these tools available, whether they are sort of cultural practices, whether they are biological tools, that we need to facilitate those and make sure that people are not relying on pesticides to do things. They don't need to do that. We heard in Italy that natural repellent substances are working very well, and that we can do it in other ways. So I thank you very much for hosting this. I thank everyone for joining us as we go forward, and that we make this change and allow that change to be made. So thank you all, and I look forward to talking with you all again. Thank you.